Welcome to the Unwind With Me podcast. I'm your host, storyteller, and narrator, Ijama. I'm starting off with a book entitled A Rip Van Winkle of the Kalahari and Other Tales of Southwest Africa. This book has 7 stories and was written by Frederick Carruthers, Cornell. This episode is the preface of the book. Most of these stories were written on the veldt, at odd times in out-of-the-way prospecting camps in the wilds of the Kalahari Desert, or of that equally little-known borderland between Klein Namakwaland and Gordonia, Cape Colony, and what was at that time known as German Southwest Africa. 4 of them appeared a few years back in The State, an illustrated magazine now unhappily defunct. The others, though written about the same time, have never been published. And now, time and circumstances have combined to bring the scene in which they are laid most prominently before the public. Through the dangerous and difficult barrier of the desert sandbelt that extends along the coast, General Botha and his formidable columns forced their way to Windhoek. From the remote lower reaches of the Orange River, other troops steadily and relentlessly pushed north. And even to the east, the well-nigh unexplored dunes of the southern Kalahari proved no safeguard to the Germans, for Union forces invaded them even there. And all eyes in South Africa are today turned towards this new addition to the Union and the Empire. Whilst imagination has naturally played the chief part in these tales, the descriptions given of certain parts of this little-known region are accurate and by no means overdrawn. At the same time, though they treat principally of the dangerous and waterless desert, it must be borne in mind that although the sand dunes form one of Damaraland's most striking features, yet it is by no means altogether the barren, scorching dust heap it is popularly believed to be. For once the sand region bordering the coast is traversed and the higher plateau begins, vegetation and water become more abundant. The climate is magnificent, and cattle, sheep, and goats thrive, whilst in the north, much of which remains practically unexplored, there is much fruitful and well-watered country teeming with game and akin to Rhodesia awaiting the settler. Mining and stock raising are the 2 great possibilities in this new country, where water conditions are never likely to allow of extensive agriculture being carried out successfully. But above all, mining. For much of the country, and especially the north, is very highly mineralized. Copper abounds. Tin and gold have been found, and there can be but little doubt that the former will eventually be located in abundance, and, above all, the diamond fields of the southwest coastal belt have, since their discovery in 1908, added enormously both to the value of the country and to its attractiveness. To refer again to these tales, the description of Rip Van Winkle's ride through the desert, the sandstorm, the huge salt pans, and indeed most of the earlier incidents have been but commonplace experiences of my own in the wastes of the southern Kalahari, slightly altered for the purposes of the story. Even the poison flowers exist there, and no bushman will sleep among them, beautiful as they are. And lest the huge diamond in the head of the snake in the same story be considered an impossibility, let it be borne in mind that the Cullinan, enormous as it was but the fragment of a monster that must have been every whit as big as the one I describe. The cataclysm is also a possibility, for although rain falls but seldom in the desert, there are occasional thunderstorms of extraordinary violence, and I have seen wide stretches of the Kalahari near the dry bed of the extinct Molopo River, long since choked and part of the desert, converted into a broad, deep lake after a cloudburst lasting but an hour or so, which drowned hundreds of head of cattle. The incident in Dick Sidney of the fracas in the bar where the Germans were toasting to the day was not written after war was declared, but one night in Luderitzbucht, full 3 years ago, after hearing that toast drunk publicly in the manner described, and after witnessing a very similar ending to it. And that particular story was refused by the then editor of the State as being too anti-German. Well, times have indeed changed. And lest a prospective Dick Sidney should think that the picture of that individual picking up 1,000 carats of diamonds in an hour or so is far-fetched, let me assure him that the first discoverers of the Pomona fields south of Luderitzbucht did literally fill their pockets with the precious stones in that space of time, and that other fields as rich may well await discovery will be denied by few who know the country. Ex Africa semper aliquid novo, never was saying truer, and Damara land, under the British flag, and with scope given to individual enterprise, may well provide still another striking example of that old adage. Frederick C. Cornell, Cape Town, 1915. Here is an introduction to the story. The manner of my meeting with him was strange in the extreme, and a fitting prelude to the wild and fantastic story he told me. I had been trading and elephant shooting in Portuguese territory in southern Angola, and hearing from my boys that ivory was plentiful in German territory. Farther south, I had crossed the Kunene River into Ambo land, and here, sure enough, I found elephants and ivory galore. So good indeed was both sport and trade in this country of the Ovampos, that by the time I reached Etosha Pau, my trade goods had vanished, and my wagon was heavily laden with fine tusks. So far had I penetrated into German territory that I decided to make my way southwest towards Walfish Bay instead of returning to Portuguese territory. But I knew I must rest my cattle well before attempting it, for it would mean an arduous trek. I had no guide, and there were no roads, for at the time I speak of, the Germans had done but little to open up the northern part of their territory. And indeed, even to the present day, much of it still remains unexplored. It is a wild and beautiful country, for the greater part well wooded and teeming with game, though towards the east it becomes drier and sandier until there stretches before the traveler nothing but the endless dunes of the unknown Kalahari Desert. Untraversed, unexplored, and mysterious, this land of the Great Thirst had always held a fascination for me. Its outlying dunes, but a few miles east of my camp, and from an isolated granite kopje near their border, I had often gazed across the apparently limitless sea of sand, stretching as far as the eye could reach to where the dancing shimmer of the mirage linked sand and sky on the far horizon. It was along the edge of these dunes that I one day followed a wounded eland so far that dusk overtook me to a long distance from my wagon. My water bottle was full, there was abundance of dry wood for a fire, and I was just debating whether I would try and get back to the wagon or camp where I was, when my horse solved the question for me by shying violently at something and throwing me clean out of the saddle. My head must have struck a stone, for I was stunned, and for a time I knew no more. When I came to myself, it was dark, but a bright fire was burning near me. A blanket covered me, and I was lying upon something soft. Evidently, someone was caring for me, and I concluded that my boys had found me, though I had given them strict instructions not to leave the wagon. "Jantje, Kambala," I called, but there was no answer, and I tried to rise, but my hurt had apparently been a severe one, for my head spun round. The fire danced before my eyes, and I again lost consciousness. When next I awoke, the fire was still burning, and a figure was seated beside it, a figure that the leaping flames rendered monstrous and distorted. The back was towards me, but at the slight rustle I made upon my bed of dry leaves in awakening, the figure turned in my direction, and I caught a momentary glimpse of the face. Firelight plays strange tricks sometimes, but the momentary flicker showed me a countenance so grotesque that I must have made an involuntary movement of surprise, for with a short laugh, the unknown man rose and came towards me, saying as he did so, "Don't be scared, even the devil isn't as black as he's painted." And, whoever he was, the way in which he tended to my throbbing head, advising me not to talk, but to rest and sleep, soon soothed my shaken nerves, and I slept again till broad daylight. I could hear the low murmur of voices, and sitting up, I saw that Jantje and Kambala had put in an appearance and were talking in an unknown tongue to my friend of the night before, a white man, but surely the strangest looking being I had ever beheld. First of all, he was a hunchback, and his body was twisted and distorted to a remarkable degree, yet in spite of his curved shoulders, he was of more than average height, and of a breadth incredible. But his face, who can describe it? Seamed and scarred in deep gashes, as though by some hideous torture, the nose broken and flattened almost upon the cheek. There remained but little human about the awful countenance except the eyes. But these, as I found later, were of a beauty and expressiveness to make one forget their terrible setting. Large, pellucid, of a bright hazel, there was something magnetic in their straight and honest gaze, and I can well believe that before he met with his awful disfigurement, their owner must have been a man of superb appearance. As I moved, he came towards me, holding out his hand as he did so, and a fine, warm-hearted grip he gave me. "Better, eh?" he said. "No, don't get up. You've had an ugly smack and must take care of yourself for a bit. And I'm afraid," he continued as he sat down beside me, "that I was the cause of your accident, for your horse shied at me, and you came near breaking your neck." "Shied at you?" I queried, in surprise, for there was scarce cover for a cat just where I had been thrown. "But where were you?" "Then I never saw you." "No, but I saw you," he replied grimly, "and having been the cause of your downfall, I could do no less than look after you till your boys came." Thus strangely began an acquaintance that lasted only all too short a time, but that was full of interest for me, for I found my new friend to be a remarkable man in more ways than in appearance. His knowledge of the region we were in was wonderful. The few natives we met treated him with every sign of respect and fear, and he seemed equally conversant with their language as with that of my own boys, Jantje, the Hottentot, and Kambala, the Herero. The habits of the game, the properties of each bush and shrub, each game path and water hole, he knew them all, and had something interesting to say about all of them. And the few days of our companionship were pleasant in the extreme. I never knew his name, and had it not been that chance came to my aid, I should probably never have heard his strange history. But it so happened that a few days after our first meeting, a buffalo, with the finest horns I had ever seen, got up within 20 yards of us, and in my eagerness to secure his wonderful head, I shot badly, and only succeeded in wounding him slightly. His terrific charge was a thing to be remembered. Straight at us he came, wild with rage, and my new friend's horse gored and screamed, went down before him in a flash. The rider was thrown, and to my horror, before I could control my own frightened animal sufficiently to enable me to shoot, the bull was upon the fallen man, goring and trampling upon him in an awful manner. Leaping from my horse, I put bullet after bullet through the big bull's head, and at length he lurched forward, dead, upon the mangled body of his victim. We had some difficulty in extricating the man, and never expected to find him alive, but though badly crushed and torn, he still breathed, and naturally I did all I could to save his life. That night he was delirious, and it was then that I had evidence of the almost superhuman strength with which he was endowed. Time after time he tore himself from the combined strength of my two sturdy boys, and always he raved of diamonds and of a never-ending search for something or someone in the desert. His hurts were sufficient to have killed 6 men, and I never expected him to live, but 2 days later he was able to tell the natives in their own tongue of certain herbs which they prepared under his direction, and in a week he was about again. His cure was nothing short of miraculous in my eyes, at least, but he made light of his own share in the matter, and was all gratitude for the little I had been able to do to atone for the result of my bad shooting. And one night, by the campfire, and with very little preamble, he told me the following strange story, which I have set down as nearly as possible in his own words. Please join me for the next episode of Unwind with Me, where I begin at chapter 1 of a Rip Van Winkle of the Kalahari. You can find out more about the podcast at unwindwithme.com.